Okay, so last class we just did the first paragraph of this chapter, of this section, and we kind of sidetracked a bit. I think it was a very important lesson, even though it's not really part of the course in the curriculum, about the different approach between how the Babylonian Talmud records certain stories as opposed to how the we'll call it the Eretz Israel sources, not just the Palestinian or the Jerusalem Talmud, but also the other midrashim that originate from the land of Israel. All right, so I'll just repeat quickly the first paragraph because it's going to help us into the next paragraph and get us started on this section. So we're talking about the period of they call it the pairs, where there were two heads of the Sanhedrin. All right, up until now, from the time he received the Torah from Moshe, up until Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, ending with Shimon HaTzadik, there was always one president of the Sanhedrin, and below him there was his second, right? He was the Av Bedin. So De'u. Okay, so first of all, we're going back. The establishment of, we'll call it Torah Chutz Ha'aretz, right? The yeshiva in Bavel, in Babylon. De'u ki barishona keshegalu Israel begalut Yechonia, right? When the Jewish people were first exiled, in the first exile, we're talking about, like, we are now discussing the second or the second temple period. Here he's taking us back to the first exile, even a little bit before the destruction of the first temple. Right? There were many working men, all the important people, including the prophets. They were also exiled to Bavel. Right? They were brought to an area in Babylon called Nehar De'ah, and that's one of the more famous yeshivot, the more famous courts in Bavel was in Nehar De'ah. ובנה יחוניה מלך יהודה וכל הנלווים אליו בית כנסייה. Right? And Yechonia, the king of Judah, who was now exiled to Bavel, with everyone with him, they built this big synagogue. This big synagogue also served as the court. ויסדוה באבנים ועפר שהביאו עמהם מבית המקדש. Right? And they consecrated it, and they put it as its founding stone on the bottom, stones that they brought with them from the temple in Jerusalem. נקיים עליהם מה שנאמר, כי נשאו עבדיך את אבניה ואת עפרה יחוננו. Right, in order to live up to this pasuk, that your servants, they like jump started with the stones and the dirt from your place, right? Your dirt and your stones, meaning from the temple. וקראו לבית כנסייה ההיא בית הכנסת דשף ויתיב. And they named this synagogue or this court the synagogue that rose and settled, that came and settled. כלומר שנשא מבית המקדש, right? That it transported, so to speak, from the Mikdash in Jerusalem, וישב כאן בנהר דעה, and is now established in Nehar De'ah, והשכינה הייתה עמהם, and along with the stones and the dirt, right, the physical form, some sort of physical remnants of the Mikdash, also the Shekhinah, which is the presence of God, was with them. Vehi Bet Knesset Dehutzav, right, and this is the Bet Knesset that was very well known back then in an area called the Hutzal, which was close to Nehar De'ah, קרובה לבית מדרשו של עזרא הסופר למטה מנהר דעה. Ezra HaSofer, who was, there's the book of Ezra named after him. He was one of the main characters in bringing the redemption back and rebuilding Jerusalem and eventually rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, right? So he had his he started off in Bavel, and he was the head of that yeshiva in Bavel in Nehar De'ah. Im kol ze, od hayu marbisim Torah gam bechan, right? So with all this, they still taught tons of Torah, both in Eretz Israel and in Babylon. Ve'elem rosh gola mibet David, and not only did they have a well-established institute for teaching Torah and enforcing the laws of the Torah, but they also had a political leadership that they called, it wasn't called a king at the time, it was called a Rosh Gola, the head of the diaspora. And the head of the diaspora was from the house of David, meaning they continued the lineage, same as Yechoniah, right? It started with Yechoniah, who was first exiled from Jerusalem, and that lineage continued on, right, as a political position to administer the Jewish people in the diaspora, right? And that position was called the head of the diaspora, and it was always from the house of David. Avan, however, Rashi Yeshiva v'Sanhedrin lo hayu b'nehem, right? They didn't have presidents of the court. The Rosh Yeshiva, he was just called the Rosh Yeshiva. He didn't have the actual authorities of the Rosh Yeshiva or of the Yeshivot or of the Sanhedrin that was back in Jerusalem. Because they all had one intention, that kind of status and that kind of authority can only come out of the place that was chosen by God, meaning Jerusalem. Okay? And now the next generation, so this is, we get all the way down to Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, right? So Adora Sheni Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the second generation was Shimon HaTzadik, Ushmo Ido ben Yehoshua ben Yotzadak HaKohen HaGadol, right? This was his name, Ido, the son of Yehoshua ben Yotzadak, and he was also the high priest in the temple. And then we spoke of a nice story of his encounter with Alexander the Great. We're talking about 40 years after the construction. They finally constructed the second temple. I'm just going to quickly, briefly tell the story where Alexander the Great, after destroying the Persian Empire, is passing through the land of Israel and wants to conquer the capital, which is Jerusalem, right? And burn down the temple. And Shimon HaTzadik came out and he confronted him, or he met him, depends which version you follow. And long story short, Alexander didn't destroy the city, and they reached some sort of agreement, whether out of respect to Shimon HaTzadik or out of as a way to prevent a bloody battle. And from then on, we started counting a new calendar. Instead of going back, instead of it year being 3,450, then they started counting from zero from that year, which happened to be also almost exactly 1,000 years after the Exodus from Egypt. All right? So this is just quickly some historical context. We are now in the era of the Greek Empire. No more, we passed the Babylonians, they destroyed our temple, and then after them came the Persians, right? The Persians brought us back and let us rebuild the temple, and now the Persians are destroyed, and in their place are the Greeks. And after the Greeks come the, who knows?
Romans.
The Romans. But between the Greeks and the Romans, who controlled Jerusalem? Who controlled the land of Israel?
Persians?
No, after the Persians came the Greeks, and then story of Hashmonaim, the Jewish people restored their own sovereignty to their own land. And they controlled it, I think it was for like about 200 years. Harishonim, where we're talking about the people mentioned in the Mishnah. So Harishonim are the people that came before them. The first, earliest of the Hachamim, Lo nod'u shemotam ki im shemot hanesiim. Right? We don't have a record of all the Hachamim or all the members of the Supreme Court prior to Shimon HaTzadik. We only know the names of the presidents, the heads of the court. Nisiim ve'avot bedin bilvad. Right? Only the heads of the court and maybe their deputies, the second in command. Mipnei kol mahloket lo hayeta benehem. Because there was never any dispute between the Hachamim. And we said, up until now, you have a question, you go to the court. The court doesn't know, they'll go with you to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, they either know the answer or they need to decide an answer. If they know the answer, they tell you, there's no dispute. If they need to now negotiate and decide an answer, then they discuss and they try to convince each other. At the end of the process, either everybody agrees on something, or they take it to a vote. And whatever the majority decides is now settled law. And now that it's settled, that's it. There's no more dispute. Dispute is over. So there was no disputes among them. Ela, kol ta'ameh ha-Torah v'ha-Mishnah hayu yedu'im lahem yedi'ah berurah. Right? They knew very precisely, and they had a very great understanding of the Torah and the Mishnah, right, and the Halachot. And there was no, and even when they come to discuss, they were all speaking more or less on the same page. So we're going to learn about the birth of the Mahlokot soon. ובעוד בית המקדש קיים, and while the temple was still standing, כבר למדו החכמים כל אחד ואחד את תלמידיו את טעמי התורה והמשנה והתלמוד. Right? So while the Mikdash was still standing, meaning while we were still secure in our land, while we were still sovereign and mostly living in peace, then the Hachamim were able to properly teach their students without any other influences, without needing to worry about running for their lives, right? So they were actually able to focus on their studies. So they were able to teach their students in depth, properly, all the ta'ameh Torah, all the reasons, the logic behind the laws, and the Mishnah and the Talmud, right? Talking about Mishnah and Talmud before the Mishnah and Talmud are actually even written, meaning all the laws, all the summaries that the Hachamim have composed over the years before it was compiled into a formal textbook. Bidvarim shayu mehubbarim b'yamim ahem. Right? Whatever was already written, we spoke about this much earlier, that the Mishnah itself was compiled from several volumes of we'll call it summaries that the Hachamim wrote for themselves. And this is what they would teach their students. So whatever they had back then, they would teach, and they were able to explain in their own words. That's why it's called Be'al Peh, oral law. Vehoru letalmidehem kefi she'evinu belibam. Right? And they instructed their students as they understood in their minds. Meaning, even if they had summaries to work off of, the instruction, the teaching was always done orally, Be'al Peh. They would formulate it in their own words. Ve'az nitrabba chokmah. And in that period, when we had the Mikdash, then that was a period where wisdom flourished. Ve'lo nitztarchu letilchot acherot. And they didn't have other worries to bother them, such as persecutions and wars. Ve'acharei alot Ezra. And after the coming of Ezra and Zerubbabel v'hagula imahem, right, and all the diaspora that came with them, v'nivna bet hamikdash, right, and they reconstructed the temple, היו שם שני ראשי סנהדרין, right? We're entering a new era where there is not one president of the Sanhedrin, but there are two presidents of the Sanhedrin. כגון שמעון הצדיק ואנטיגונוס איש סוחו ושאר הזוגות, right? So in the times of Shimon HaTzadik, there was another president also serving along or in parallel with Shimon HaTzadik, and his name was Antigonus. Antigonus ish socho. Ush'ar HaZugot, we have like 5 generations now where there are not one head of the Sanhedrin, one supreme or president of the Supreme Court, but there are 2 in parallel. Ush'ar HaZugot rubam alu miBavel. Most of them, of these heads of the Sanhedrin, are people who returned to Eretz Israel from Bavel. Gam Hillel HaZaken ala imahem. And Hillel, everyone is familiar with the name Hillel, and Hillel and Shammai, right? The 2 well-known, presidents of the Sanhedrin who had many mahlokot, right? Many disagreements. Well, you may be surprised to find out that they didn't have that many disagreements. The times of the Zugot is a time where we transition from the court not having any mahlokot between them to a time where now there is one mahloket between them. Each head of the Sanhedrin has they inherit the same mahloket from the previous one. Each one represents a different opinion, and we'll see that. והורו לתלמידיהם כפי שהבינו בליבם, right? And they each taught their students as they themselves knew and understood. ואז נתרבה חוכמה ולא נצטרכו לטרחות אחרות, right? As we saw before, and you get it of Shir HaGaon, this is a time up until now where there are no mahlokot until we reach the Zugot ומחלוקת הסמיכה לבדה הייתה ביניהם. All right, and there was one mahloket that represents this period of the Zugot, the semicha. What is the semicha? When you bring a korban to the Beit Mikdash, a korban hatat, you have to push the head of the cow and apply your full weight to it when you are doing the vidui, right? When you do when you confess your sins, right? Why you bringing this korban is because you did some sort of transgression, and when you confess this transgression, you need to do semicha. Semicha is actual. You place your hands upon it and lean upon the bull. So they had a mahloket. Are you allowed to do this semicha on your korban on Yom Tov, or because of a different gezirat hachamim that says that that it's considered like riding an animal, if you're putting your whole body weight on it, then maybe you should be forbidden from doing it on Yom Tov. So one hacham says it's mutar, and the other one says it's asur. You can't do it on Yom Tov. You can only do it on a regular day, on Yom Chol. וגם משבאו שמאי והלל לא נפלגו כי אם בשלושה דברים כמו שאמרו בשבת. Right? And the last of those 5 Zugot was Shammai and Hillel. And they expanded the mahloket to include 2 more things, a total of 3 mahlokot. Shammai and Hillel have only 3 mahlokot between them. As it says in Tractate of Shabbat in the Talmud, Amar Rav Huna, Bishlosha mekomot nichleku Shammai vehillel. In 3 places did Shammai and Hillel have a dispute. Right, and I'm going to bring here. I'm going to bring here a Mishnah in Masechet Hagiga. All right, you may recognize some of these names since Pirkei Avot, right? Tractate of Avot starts with a lot of these names. What were their teachings, their moral teachings? All right, so Mishnah in Hagiga says, Yosef ben Yoezer omer shelo lismoch, Yosef ben Yochanan omer nismoch. Right? These are the different zugot. Yosef ben Yoezer, right, says you must do semicha. Yosef ben Yochanan says, he says not to do semicha, while Yosef ben Yochanan says you do semicha. Nismoch. Next generation, Yehoshua ben Perachia omer shelo lismoch, Itai ha'arbeni omer nismoch. And these are each heads of the yeshiva serving at the same time in parallel in the same court. Yehuda ben Tabbai omer shelo lismoch, Shimon ben Shatach omer nismoch. Shemaya omer nismoch, Avtalion omer shelo lismoch. Hillel u'Menachem. All right, and now there's two, Hillel and not Shammai, but someone named Menachem. Lo nechliku. There's a problem here. They don't have a dispute. They both agree that you should do semicha. So what do? Yatsa Menachem, nichnas Shammai. All right, we finally have a generation where they come to an agreement whether you do semicha or not. They say, sorry, that's not good. It's like they want to perpetuate this mahloket for some reason. Hillel and Menachem lo nechliku. They had no mahloket. The times of no mahloket are over. Yatsa Menachem, nichnas Shammai. Shammai omer shelo lismoch. Hillel omer nismoch. Now they can continue this dispute. Meaning this is a dispute that the Mishnah decided not to settle. The court decided not to settle it. Harishonim hayu nesiim, ushniim lahem av bedin. So the first ones, right? This column, right? This Yosef ben Yoezer, Yehoshua ben Perachia, Yehuda ben Tabbai, Shammai, Shemaya, and Shammai. They were all nesiim, and everyone on the other column were Av Beit Din. Nesiim is the president, Av Beit Din, the heads of the Beit Din. All right, and then we get to a new period, which is the period of Shimon and Hillel and Shammai. So here in the Mishneh Torah, Antigonos Yisacho Bedino Kiblu Mishimon HaTzadik Bedino. VeYosef ben Yoezer ish Sereda, VeYosef ben Yochanan ish Yerushalayim Bedinam. Right now it's transitioning to the plural because now it's a new era of the pairs, the Zugot. Kibelu Antigonos Bedino. Yehoshua ben Perachia v'Nitai ha'arbeni Bedinam. Kiblu min Yosef VeYosef Bedinam. Yosef ben Yoezer and Yosef ben Yochanan. ויהודה בן טבעי ושמעון בן שטח ובית דינם קיבלו מיהושע וניתאי ובית דינם. שמעיה ואבטליון גרי הצדק, right? Shemaya and Avtalion, they were both converts, and they were both appointed to the heads of the Sanhedrin, serving in parallel to each other. They also had this mahloket between them. ובית דינם קיבלו מיהודה ושמעון ובית דינם, והלל ושמאי ובית דינם קיבלו משמעיה ואבטליון ובית דינם. Right, so this is the transmission from one generation to the other. Right, one generation receives the Torah Shebe'al Peh from the previous court before them, before they're appointed to be heads of the court, and we get to Hillel and Shammai, the last of the Zugot. And then we have Raban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Raban Shimon beno shel Hillel, Kibelu mihillel ubedino. All right, and now we're going to be transitioning into a new stage. All right, we'll get to that soon. We have Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. He was the head of the Supreme Court in the times of the destruction of the Second Temple. And the Rabban Shimon, right? Rabban Shimon also has a nice lineage of all the way back to Hillel, Beno shel Hillel, right? All the way back. It starts with Hillel, and then it starts with Rabban Shimon, then Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and then Rabban Gamliel ben Shimon, and another Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, until we get to the composer of the Mishnah, who is Rabbeinu HaKadosh, right? Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. So Rabban Shimon beno shel Hillel kibbelu mihillel ubet dino. Okay, so let's go back here for a second. So from the times of the Zugot, which how do you call it? Transition from 0 mahlokot to 1 mahloket. We now transfer from them to Shammai and Hillel. Shammai and Hillel had 3 mahlokot, right? You know what? Maybe we'll not get into this. This is all Aramaic. Okay. So, any questions up until now? Okay, so let's continue. Now we're reading from Sefer HaKabbalah. Hillel alam Babel. Right? Hillel, as we said before, he came to Eretz Israel from Babel. He himself was one of the exiled, or was born in the diaspora, and came back to Eretz Israel. Vu ben Mem, and he's 40 years old when he came. Vilamad Mem Shana, and he studied Torah 40 years, right? And he also taught Torah 40 years. Ki Kuf Kaf 120 years, Ayu Yemei Hayav. He lived a long life, 120 years. And Hillel himself was descendant of King David. Umibet David Hayam Zera Melucha. Right? He was from the royal family. Upet Talmidim Hayulo, and he had 80 students. Gadol Shebekulam Yonatan ben Uziel. Yonatan ben Uziel is one of the oldest translations we have of the Torah, and big parts of the Tanakh translated from Hebrew to Aramaic. He was one of the greatest. He was the greatest of Hillel's students. Katan shebekulam Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Right? And he's also the youngest among his students. So while he was a student, he was the youngest one. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who later became the president of the court. Vaya havero shel Hillel Menachem. Right? And Hillel's friend was Menachem. Umet beyamav. Menachem passed away during the lifetime of Hillel and during his presidency. And they didn't have this dispute, this mahloket of whether you do semicha or not. V'yasa Menachem v'nichnas Shammai. So Menachem, he's no longer he's counterparty to Hillel, and Shammai comes in and is appointed in his place after Menachem passes away. Now Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, so he received Torah from both Hillel and Shammai. However, this is already the end of the Second Temple era. So we have a transition from 0 mahlokot to 1 mahloket. This mahloket lasts 5 generations. The end of these 5 generations, we have Hillel and Shammai, which they have a total of 3 mahlokot. And their student, right, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai receives Torah from both of them. However, in his times, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Ala Aspasianus an Yerushalayim. So Aspasianus, he was, this is already times of the Romans. He was a Roman general. So he came to conquer Jerusalem. Vaya b'Yerushalayim Abbas Sikra Rosh HaListim. And in Jerusalem at that time, Rosh HaListim is like the head of the mafia in Jerusalem. one of the great criminal organizations in Jerusalem, right? So the head of the mafia, the Al Capone there is Abbas Sikra. That's his name, Abbas Sikra. והיה בן אחותו של רבן יוחנן בן זכאי. He was the nephew of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. So you have on the one hand the Supreme Court, the president of the Supreme Court, right? A Sadiq Gamur, very, very, how do you call it? Pure person, very law-abiding person. The head of the Supreme Court is Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and his nephew is the head of the mafia in Jerusalem. הוא יצא בלט אל המלך אספסיאנוס ושאל ממנו שיצא אליו רבן יוחנן בן זכאי. Right? So, as the head of the mafia, he has a lot of influence on people. And he even had influence on Vespasian, I think that's his name in English, Aspasianus, the general of the Roman army that's coming to siege Jerusalem and destroy it. And he asked that he let Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai go, free him from Jerusalem. ועשה המלך בקשתו. And he agreed. He said, fine. ויצא אליו. And he went out of Jerusalem. He was saved from Jerusalem. וידע המלך את רוב חוכמתו וכיבדו ונישאו. And the king of Jerusalem, of Aspasianus, the king, he recognized the wisdom of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, right? And he gave him a lot of respect, and he exalted him above other people. He listened to what he has to say. והוא היה שר על ירושלים, right? He was a general who was appointed to Jerusalem. During this time, right, we say Aspasianus is the general of the Roman army. The Caesar is Neron. If you ever heard, any Roman history, Neron was one of the craziest Caesars that ruled Rome. He's known today to be one of the worst Caesars of Rome. Anyways, he died. If I'm not mistaken, he was actually murdered. מת נירון קיסר מלך רומי ונמנו יועצי רומי שימלוך אספסיאנוס. Right? So, Neron, the Caesar of Rome, is now dead. And the top officials in the Senate in Rome, they decide that in his place, he's not going to be inherited by his son, but they want to appoint Aspasianus, the general of Judah, to come and rule in his place. So he went to Rome. And his son, Titus, is the one that we know as the destroyer of Jerusalem and the one who burnt down the temple, was the son of Aspasianus, who now became Caesar of Rome, the king of Rome. And he now appointed him to be the general, Titus to be the general over Jerusalem. וציווהו לכבד לרבן יוחנן בן זכאי מאוד. And he instructed his son Titus to respect Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and to have to maybe negotiate with him, to give him his wishes. וחרב בית המקדש ב-3829. In the year 3829 is when the second temple was destroyed. ונהרג רבי ישמעאל בן אלישע כהן גדול. And along with this destruction, the sacking of the city, Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha, who was the high priest at the time, was killed in the conquering of the city. Verashbag Hazaken, and also Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Hazaken, right, who was the son of Hillel, he was also killed in the city. ורצה טיטוס להרוג את רבן גמליאל בנו. And Titus, who was now conquering the city, also targeted specifically, he wanted to kill the other head of the court, Rabban Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the grandson of Hillel. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai v'nitpayes. However, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai interfered on his behalf, and he spoke to Titus, and he said, please spare Rabban Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the son of Hillel HaZaken. And he agreed. We also know there was something else that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is famous for. He says, please give me Yavne v'Hachamea. Since Jerusalem is about to be destroyed, they wanted to relocate the Supreme Court to Betar, which is a little bit south of Jerusalem, which is also where, to Yavne, not to Betar, to Yavne. Nimtzu asara dorot. So we're talking about 10 generations now. Vehem Zerubbabel, from the return of the diaspora. Vehem Zerubbabel v'abayim imo, right? Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel, who came back, right, to rebuild Jerusalem. Ad Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, until Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, which is the destruction of Jerusalem. So it was 10 generations. Gamu haya kaf kuf shanim. And he also lived 120 years, similar to Hillel. Nit'asek 40 shana bepagmatia, right? So 40 years he spent as a businessman and studied Torah for 40 years. V'chol chokhmah she'ayta bedoro. So he studied Torah for 40 years and any other wisdom that was accessible in his generation. So he knew, he knew astronomy very well. He knew linguistics. He knew languages. He knew sciences. He studied any wisdom that was available, any science that was available at his time. He studied. V'limed Israel mem shana ushfatan, and he also taught the Jewish people for 40 years, and also judged them as one of the Supreme Court judges. Right, and after the destruction of the temple, he relocated to Yavne. ושם שפט את ישראל ותיקן תקנות וסייגות לתורה עד שנפטר ביבנה. And over there in Yavne, once he relocated the court to Yavne, that's where he continued to judge and teach Torah to the Jewish people. And then they went to Beitar as well. And this is also in Beitar, which is a little bit south of Jerusalem, is where the headquarters were of Bar Kokhba, who revolted against the Roman Empire, and which was a failed revolt, which brought eventually to the complete destruction of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. All right? Any questions? So, a little bit of history.
Yes, I heard this story of Vespasian and Titus and Yochanan ben Zakkai. Maybe you can tell a little, because it's such a lovely story, when Yochanan ben Zakkai was transported in the coffin out of Jerusalem.
Okay, so one of the things that really helped him was his nephew being the head of the mafia. Because we're talking about a time of a siege on Jerusalem. And Jerusalem from within was very, very divided. Many different groups. And they each had their own approach to the war. Some said, we need to surrender, right? Others said, by the way, a very, very well-known Jewish historian, I don't know if you've ever heard the name, Josephus Flavius. He was from the family of the Kohanim, right? He was the commander in the north, in the Galilee. And he surrendered, and was helping Titus, in his eyes, also helping the Jewish people to try to convince them to surrender. He said, our time is over. If you want to save the temple, if you want to save your lives, it's time to surrender. And he told Vespasian, how do you say his name, Sarah?
We pronounce it Vespasian. But I'm not, yeah.
So Vespasian, who was then general, the father of Titus, he told, talking about Josephus Flavius, he told Vespasian that he bowed down to the king, which was considered treason in the Roman Empire, just because there's only one king, and the king is Neron, the Caesar, and he called him Caesar. And he said, no, you are going to become Caesar in Neron's place, which was even worse, right? But then, when Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai left Jerusalem, so what happened was, in Jerusalem, as I said, they were very, very divided, different approaches to the war, and they were called the Kanaim, the Zealots. They burnt down all the supplies in Jerusalem in order to force the people to fight. They didn't let anybody leave Jerusalem, because that was like a sickness, and anyone who tried to leave Jerusalem, they would kill. However, it is forbidden to bury dead people in Jerusalem. So the only way out was to fake your death and to go out with a coffin. Now, what they did is, in order to get Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai out of Jerusalem, they said, okay, let's pretend that he's very ill for a while, and then we'll announce that he passed away, and we'll put him in a coffin, and take the coffin out, smuggle him out in the coffin. Well, it wasn't really coffins like they have today, but they would wrap, they would carry him out and wrap him around in a cloth or something. And so what the Zealots would do, because they knew, a lot of people, they're going to just fake their deaths and get carried out of Jerusalem. They said, whoever passes through, for burial, we're going to stab them with our sword, to make sure they're dead. And if they're not dead, well, now they'll be dead. So nobody thinks of running away. However, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, he's a very prestigious person, and it's his nephew, the head of the mafia, who is helping smuggle him out of Jerusalem. So they come to take him out. So it sense that his nephew, even though he's the head of the mafia, is going to participate in his funeral and take him out of Jerusalem. And the Kanaim say, okay, we're just gonna, as we do with everyone, stab him. And Abbas Sikra, the head of the mafia, says, are you crazy? You're gonna stab Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai? And he says, well, that's what we do to make sure. So he says, fine, you can stab him, but I'm stabbing you. And so they really had to make a choice. Are they going to go head to head with the head of the mafia, and or are they going to just let him pass at least this one time? And then when Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was out of Jerusalem, right, so that night fell and everything, and he's there alone, and he gets up and he goes to the Roman camp, and he greets Vespasian, saying, hail the new king of Rome, the Caesar. Now, it's not recorded anywhere that he heard this from two sources. However, we have it recorded from Josephus that this is what he said to Vespasian, and that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai as well, separately, in the Talmud, it's recorded that this is what he said to Vespasian. Eventually, that's exactly what happened. Neron was I think he was murdered in Rome, and all the officials decided to appoint Vespasian as the next Caesar of Rome. And following this, Titus had a lot of respect, obviously, for the predictions of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and as well as he also gave a lot of respect to Josephus. His name was Yosef ben Matityahu, that's his Hebrew name, Yosef son of Matityahu. Remember, Matityahu is a priestly name. You know, the Hashmonaim, they were all priests, right? So he's also very likely from their lineage of Matityahu a Kohen. Yosef ben Matityahu was then his name became a Roman name. Josephus Titus Flavius, right? He even adopted the name of Titus, as he was like his historian recording everything, and it's also one of the most his books, his historical books, are also considered to be one of the most authoritative and authentic recordings of Jewish history from that time. Also because he didn't try to sugarcoat anything. He told things as they were. Usually national historians, they have an intention to make their nation sound great. Our historians never had that complex. He said, this is where we went wrong, and this is how we could have done better, and this is what happened. These were our strong points, and these were our shortcomings and failures. So that's the story of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai in the times of Titus and the destruction of Jerusalem for the second time, along with the Second Temple.
Thank you very much. I
My
didn't
pleasure.
know half of it.
Thank you for bringing it up.
תודה רבה.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank
we
you.
still have a few minutes left. We'll finish this last section. All right, and then we could start fresh next week. All right, so La'el katav Shimon beno Rabban Gamliel hazaken beno Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel beno. Right, we said there's a lineage now of Shimon and Gamliel. Right. By the way, my name is my Hebrew name is Shemuel. My father's name is Moshe. My son's name is Moshe. My father's father's name is Shemuel. So Shemuel, and then Moshe, and then Shemuel, and then Moshe. And so we see this kind of tradition, this kind of minhag, all the way back in the times of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who was the son, right? He was the son of Gamliel, and he was Shimon, and his son was also Gamliel, and his son was Shimon, and his son was Gamliel, right? And then sometimes you have to differentiate: is it Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel the first, or the elder, or the second, or the third, right? And they were each one of them were presidents of the Supreme Court. Right, v'chein ita b'gemara, and so it says also in the Talmud, Hillel v'Shimon Gamliel v'Shimon nahagu nesiyutam me'ashana lifnei churban habayit. So starting from Hillel, it's 100 years before the destruction of the temple, and we go down to Shimon Gamliel, and then Shimon, right, the son of that Gamliel, right. This is all a span of 100 years, and this last one was the one who was spared by Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai by pleading to Titus not to kill him. Uvno haya Rabban Gamliel hazaken, uven beno Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel harishon. Right? Okay, and his son was Rabban Gamliel the elder, and his grandson was Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel harishon. Sorry, this was the one, if I'm not mistaken, who was spared thanks to Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's intervention. Right, so all these people had they were presidents in the Supreme Court. The times of the temple was like 100 years, the span of 100 years. right? In the times of the family of King Harold's reign. שכן היה מנהג בבית שני שהמלך מבית חשמונאי, right? Throughout the times of the Second Temple, the king was from the family of the Hashmonaim, who restored the temple and Jerusalem to Jewish sovereignty, and they were kings at the time. או מעבדיהם בני הורדוס, or from their slaves. Hordus, King Harold, wasn't actually from the family of Hashmonai, he was one of their servants, he was Idumean. היה המוציא והמביא במלחמה ובכל דברי המלכות. Right, they were the leaders at war, they were like the supreme commander of the army, of the military, and anything to do with the monarchy, right, they were the heads, either from the family of Hashmonai or from their servants, their Idumean servants, like King Harold. אבל כל דברי תורה, חוקים ומשפטים, על פי הנשיא מבית דוד היו נעשים. However, anything that pertains to the legal aspect of the Torah, right, the judiciary, that was all in the hands of the Supreme Court. And since the lineage of King David is no longer now kings, rulers, right, now it's in the hands of the Kohanim from Hashmonaim, so they always made sure to appoint the head of the Sanhedrin, if there was someone worthy of it, from the house of David, to make him the head of the Sanhedrin. And there's a story in Tractate of Sanhedrin, מעשה ברבן גמליאל, שהיה יושב על גב מעלה בהר הבית, ויוחנן סופר הלז יושבים לפניו ג' איגרות פתוחות. Right, there's this event that happens. Raban Gamliel, who is currently the president of the Sanhedrin, he is sitting on one of the steps in Harabait, and Yochanan Sofer Alaz, and he has his scribe sitting with him. He has 3 open letters in front of him. Ve'amar tol agarta hada. Take, this is now in Aramaic, take one of these letters. Uchtov la'hana benegaluta de Bavel, right, and write to our brethren who are in the diaspora in Bavel. La'hana benegaluta de Madai, right, and our brethren who are in the galut and diaspora of Madai, of Persia. V'la'hana benegaluta de Yavan, and our brethren in the diaspora of Greece. Ush'ar kol galutehon de Israel, and to all the rest of the diasporas, wherever the Jewish people are spread, Shalom Echon Izgeh, right? Peace be upon you. Mehoda'ana lechon de amaraya de aktin v'guzlaya rekichin v'yiraha de abiba lo mata, right? I want to inform you all that he's talking about some of the signs of springtime. He says the springtime hasn't come yet, right? It's coming late this year, right? We know we sometimes we have an extra month in the year because according to Jewish law, we have to make sure that Passover falls in the spring. So today we calculate, but back then, or the proper way, and also in the future, it'll be based on the court's decision, what year we are going to add an extra month to. And they always do this in the month of Adar, which is the month before Nisan. If the springtime hasn't come yet, then the court would add an extra month. All right? So he says, we see the springtime hasn't come yet. V'shafart milta be'anpe, right? And it is right in my eyes, u'be'anpe haverei, and my friends' eyes, meaning my friends in the Sanhedrin, ve'osifat al shata dayarhahad. And we want to add an extra month to this year. Now, when we were talking about Alexander the Great coming and setting the calendar, meaning we are counting from now, right? Year 0. And this is Minyan Shtarot. For all legal documents from now on will be based on this day, right? It's the equivalent of having your face on the coin, right? It's it's reserved for the kings or the presidents, right? And especially with us, the Jewish people, one of the most significant things to us is sanctifying time. That is like the highest honor, and that is surpasses the authority of any king. Hare yadanu, right? So from this story we see Rabban Gamliel ze Rosh Yeshiva V'Nasi, right? This Rabban Gamliel, he is the head of the Supreme Court. He is the president. Uma'asav mikubalim b'chol Eretz Israel, and his actions are accepted by everybody in Eretz Israel. Ubechol galuyot Israel, and throughout the entire diaspora of Israel. He is informing that we are adding an extra month to the calendar. Yom Kippur is going to be a month later than you expected. God is going to atone for your sins a month later if you don't follow, or not atone for your sins, if you don't follow my decree. Velo miha hamelech velo adam ba'olam. And nobody objected to his decree. Not the king and not anybody else, right? So we see that the authority of the Supreme Court, even after the destruction or throughout the times of the destruction, was maintained by the Supreme Court, and it's a much farther reaching authority than the king. The king, King Harold, he has a lot of power, but his power is limited to the land of Judah. He can take apart, if you've ever been to the Herodian, he can take apart 2 mountains and construct his own headquarters over there, his summer vacation, a new huge mountain over here. He could completely renovate the temple. However, none of his decisions affect the Jewish people as long-term as the Supreme Court. And nobody objected to the authority of Rabban Gamliel, who was the actual president of the Supreme Court. Okay, so that's it for today. Of course, anybody has questions, I'd be happy to respond.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Maybe I missed it. It's also possible. But when the Supreme Court would say, okay, or the Sanhedrin, we need to add an extra month Adar because the spring is not come. Yeah.
Right.
How did they know that the spring wasn't come?
So there are all sorts of signs. For instance, if we sing on Tu B'Shvat, we sing Ashkeria Porachat, Hashemesh Gamzor, right? The almond trees are blossoming. This comes before the spring. If that hasn't happened yet, then the spring hasn't come yet. Certain types of trees that start to flourish beforehand, and also those are like call it the physical manifestations of the pre-spring time. They also know how to calculate. For instance, when you go according to a solar year, we know that the spring starts on the 21st of March every single year. So how do you do that calculation? It's very simple. It's 365 days and 6 hours in a year, right? And so you calculate every 91 and a quarter days is it's a little less, okay, half an eighth. Every 91 and an eighth days is a new season, always, right? So and they use those calculations also to decide what years need to add an extra month. You should do a whole class just on the Hebrew calendar. If it interests you all, I'd be happy to do it sometime. Really get into the calculations, and you can learn to make your own calendar. So actually, I find it interesting. If you all find it interesting, maybe we could find time for that too.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.